Okay, Bismillah. Jazakumullah khairan everyone for attending Al-Arqam Institute's 11th annual Ramadan sessions. We are currently on the second presentation of our four-part series taking place every Saturday throughout the month of Ramadan. To recap, last Saturday we spoke with Dr. Olamir Anjum on liberalism. In the coming weeks, we plan on discussing scientism with Dr. Osman Omarji and secularism with Sister Dania Muhammad. These talks are made available on Al-Arqam's Facebook page and YouTube channel, so please make sure to stay tuned and share, inshallah. Our speaker this week is Sister Aisha Hasan, who is speaking on the topic of feminism. Sister Aisha is the founder and editor of the Qarawiyyin Project, an initiative dedicated to reviving Islamic discourse among Muslim women. Launched in 2018, the online platform and podcast seeks to engage women around the world in conversations related to Islam and modern challenges. Having studied issues related to women and Islam for 10 years, she regularly speaks at community events and universities in the UK on topics related to women in the Islamic tradition and challenges for Muslim communities in the West. A researcher in international development by profession, she graduated with a bachelor's in economics from SOAS, University of London, and with a master's in development studies from the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's also a student of Islamic studies and a Quran teacher, mashallah. Just some quick ground rules before we start. The session should be around 2 hours. The last half hour of our time together will be an opportunity for questions and answers. For those who have questions, please feel free to message the moderator named Q&A with your questions, and we'll try to address as many as we can, inshallah. And with that out of the way, Sister Aisha, the floor is yours.
جزاك خير Sister Bahnan. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum everybody. Good evening from London and good afternoon to those of you who I know are watching this in the States. I'd like to thank Al-Arqam Institute for inviting me today, and I feel very honored to be participating in this Ramadan program, alhamdulillah, alongside the other distinguished speakers, many of whom I consider my own teachers. And I pray that inshallah what I have to contribute today will be of benefit. And I look forward to also engaging with those who are listening in the question and answer session. Inshallah, my talk today should be in about an hour and 15 minutes, and then hopefully we can open it up to the virtual floor. It is after Maghrib here, so please bear with me if I take a bit of water every so often too. My topic today is one that I think elicits very strong reactions. And I think that existing contributions on this issue do tend to aggravate more people than they please, by virtue of the very strong opinions that people have on this topic. But I'm hoping to, inshallah, approach this today in a different manner and from several angles. And I'll also say here as a disclaimer that depending on which part of this talk you listen to, whether now or in the recording, you could come to vastly different conclusions of what I'm trying to say. So I'd ask that you bear with me. I do see my talk today as almost kind of three different parts, divided into three parts. The first is looking at how we can approach and define feminism before we even start this conversation. The second is then looking at feminism and Islam and attempts to reconcile the two. And the third part is looking at misogyny in the Muslim community. So to that end, I want to start today, inshallah, by discussing a little of where I feel this conversation does go wrong in the Muslim community and the direction that I will, inshallah, be approaching this from. So I have a PowerPoint, just inshallah share this. Okay, so far so good. Oh, we go. Okay, so where this discussion goes wrong. Firstly, I think as everyone is well aware, discussions on feminism in the community have a tendency to be very polemical on all sides. There are not simply strong reactions, but there is a drive to box people into certain labels. There's a lot of sloganism going on, a lot of rhetoric, and huge generalizations being made. And this is a problem because it hardly encourages people of different perspectives to come to the table and actually engage on this topic. Instead, there's a lot of mudslinging going on. Secondly, there's a lot of simplification of this issue. when it and something as deep and as broad as feminism. It's become standard in the UK, at least, for example, there to be an event every year at college MSAs on feminism and or women in Islam. I've also seen some weekend courses in the UK that promise to teach all the fundamentals of Western philosophy in just a weekend, and they dedicate a couple of hours of that program to feminism. And so there's essentially this mentality that feminism is something that can be addressed and evaluated in a short period of time by one person. And this is really impossible with any field of study. And it's a shame that instead of giving people an insight into feminist discourse and feminist studies, what we see is that there's a more of a mindset of a kind of been there, done that kind of attitude towards feminism. And this ignores the fact that there's a lot of scholarship on this work. And in addition to that, perhaps more than any other topic on this month's agenda, feminism is something that I think is manifesting itself in numerous different ways and is still to a great extent evolving. So reducing feminism to one type of women's activism and then writing that off is disingenuous and not actually helpful in trying to navigate the arguments and theories that it's putting forward. Thirdly, I would argue that this conversation is often heavily anecdotal. People's positions on this issue tend to be framed by how they see feminism or misogyny manifesting or how it's perceived to manifest, as opposed to its intellectual roots. Now, I'm not saying that anecdotes are not evidence, of course they are, but for anecdotes to be taken as evidence in any kind of research, you need a wide spectrum of experience. You need a lot of participants from varying backgrounds to really understand how this phenomena is manifesting. That's when it becomes data. And this is not something that we see. More often what we see is people basing their experience of these issues on X brother or Y sister that they saw at the masjid or they saw on social media. And it's quite common even for Muslim personalities to make entire talks or entire articles based upon a couple of examples that they'll cite in that. However, I think more recently, we've seen that there have been some attempts in this debate, in the Muslim community at least, to evidence it a little bit more. But unfortunately, this is often through the use of arguments that are rooted in things like evolutionary biology or evolutionary psychology, foundations which we wouldn't accept as justifications when it comes to other topics. So this really isn't the most solid understanding upon which we base our understanding of men and women as Muslims. This is not to ignore, obviously, studies on gender differences and empirical studies about that, but the use of this evidence is often selective. So it does little other than add resentment in many cases. I think we also can't detach societal influences from this conversation. I think it's important to bring it up here, because obviously these conversations that we're having are not taking place in a vacuum. We live in this age of so-called identity politics and culture wars, and current debates surrounding gender are influencing the positions that people are taking in these other debates. And I see this, I think, a little bit more in the US than in the UK, because the LGBT agenda is somewhat more controversial in the political sphere, whereas here it's very much an accepted norm. But the fear that people are having because of conversations that are being promoted by the trans lobby, I don't think we can detach that from how people are framing feminism and how they're framing all of these various movements that are discussing things to do with gender. I think we need to acknowledge that. In addition to this, the way in which people are even communicating on this topic also matters. A few years ago, I used to hear several people, including imams and scholars, people in the community, talk about how social media is not real life. We can't base our understanding of real life from social media, and that's definitely true to an extent. But at the same time, we've seen the impact that narratives on social media have in the real world. We've got the evidence of the role that social media played in the election of Donald Trump, in the Brexit vote in this country, and in rising populism across the world. And more than that, we are now 1 year into this coronavirus pandemic, which has seen most of us had our real world contact with people drastically reduced or sometimes cut off entirely. So for many people, especially I would argue, the younger generation, Gen Z, their communication with society is now happening entirely through social media. And this brings a whole host of problems, not least because things can turn a lot sour much faster when you are behind a screen, or things can be misinterpreted much more easily when you only have 280 characters on Twitter, for example. Discussing deep, nuanced topics like this online is really a recipe for disaster, but unfortunately, it's a disaster that we see repeated again and again. And finally, I think that generally the mindset with which we hear this conversation approached in our community is very much that, Islam does not need these isms. These are foreign concepts to the deen. They've emerged in the West, and Islam already talks about women's rights. So this is just going to be a path to kufr. And actually, I think that this approach speaks more to the trauma of colonialism than it does to Islam. Because when we look back at the classical period of Islamic history, we all read about the great polymaths and the thinkers of the past, and we see that they had no problem engaging with the contributions of Greek civilization, for example, and building on their developments in astronomy and in the natural sciences, or responding to their beliefs and their philosophies. What we see later, however, is that, for example, in India, with the arrival of British colonialism and the British rulers, is that scholarly institutions were, rightly in many cases, fearful of the change that colonizers were bringing to their society. So they turned inward and they held fast to their cultural and their Islamic learning as an act of self-defense. Now, that may have worked for them there to an extent, depending on their circumstances. I'm not here to pass judgment on that. But for us now as Muslims to embody that same behavior really prevents us from learning what others have to say and from adding our own contributions. Instead, we become static, we become unchanging, and eventually, sink into irrelevance. We think that by saying we don't need to go anywhere else to learn, that we are praising Islam, but actually this is an act of arrogance because we're praising ourselves. We're saying that our understanding is perfect and we don't need to exert ourselves in the face of new information or new realities. And this really flies in the face of the timelessness that Islam is founded upon. We need to see knowledge as both an asset and a challenge, to learn from it, whilst of course not sacrificing our own principles and our own tradition. So all that said, today, inshallah, I'm going to make an effort to avoid, hopefully, some of these common pitfalls and to address this issue with hopefully more balance and more rigor. I will not be taking what may seem to be a more standard approach to this topic by summarizing what feminism is and then talking about what Islam says. This is not a talk about women in Islam, nor do I claim that my talk will even be a comprehensive evaluation of all types of feminism. I'd say actually that my fundamental objective for us today is to explore how we can go beyond this label of feminism, beyond treating it as this kind of dirty word. I'm not really interested in how people apply that label because very often it's inconsistent. The word is unimportant. I want us to talk about the ideas that are behind this label, and those can vary. I ultimately care about us as Muslims, inshallah, understanding how we can engage in discourse of gender justice. And that means recognizing the limits of what we can learn, the limits of feminist theory, as well as the things that we can learn from it and what parts of feminist contributions we can benefit from. And then finally, I want us to focus on understanding the breadth of problems that Muslim women are facing and how we as a community can together, inshallah, progress on those fronts. Next slide. Okay, so first to definitions. Again, this is not as straightforward as people would think, not least because feminism is increasingly something that is being claimed by anyone and everyone who talks about quote unquote women's rights. But I think that we need to actually distinguish between who is using this term and why. What do we actually mean when we refer to feminism? Because on the one hand, you have feminism as, it's an academic discipline. And here I've put that this can, be broadly defined as the theory of political, economic, and social equality of the sexes. This is a body of knowledge. This is what you will find in, your university departments that are studying gender studies and, looking at the empirical reality and theorizing about relationships between men and women. But feminism is also kind of as a subset to that, a tool of analysis to critique the systems that we currently live under by taking into consideration a gendered dimension to different phenomena. So for example, my background is in economics, and one thing that I studied at university was feminist economics, which is a more particular area that looks critically at how modern capitalist production either excludes women or exploits them by holding them to the same standard as men. On the other hand, you also have feminism that is concerned with more of, the activist sphere. It's the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of equality. This is something that we're all very familiar with, and people identify themselves as feminist within that category, with those focuses in mind. Feminism is also, to an extent, a fluid historical movement that is capable of incorporating different concerns and changing realities. And we see this clearly in the different historical waves of mainstream liberal feminism that we all know about. And obviously, we are currently witnessing the fourth wave. And we're seeing that feminism is becoming more intersectional. It's taking on board previous criticisms of it. So it's nothing else if not dynamic. So when people blanketly either endorse or criticize feminism, I think it's worth asking what they actually mean by that. Are we talking about feminism as an academic discipline that's concerned with gender? Are we talking about activism? Are we talking about historical movement that we're witnessing? Are we talking about feminism as an analytical tool to understand the systems we live under today? And I would argue that very often people haven't thought that deeply about what they're referring to. As a term, feminism has become so overused that basically anything to do with women is lumped in this category. And then you have people either endorsing all of it or writing it all off. And we need to be more nuanced to have a genuine conversation about these ideas. So with that said, today, inshallah, I see my talk as kind of the remaining part of it as divided between the first two definitions of this slide. Part one is going to look at feminism as theory and efforts made by academic scholars of this discipline to reconcile it with Islamic principles. And part two is going to discuss feminism as a practice of advocacy. Why is this something that we're hearing in the Muslim community? How do we engage with it? What is and how do we understand it? There we go. So starting with feminism as theory, I think the first question we need to ask is, which feminism are we talking about? Even when we approach feminism as this academic discipline, it's far from a monolith. And people will point to the numerous different schools within feminist theory as a whole to show this diversity and to show this growth. I'm just going to go through some of these briefly here. Obviously, liberal feminism is the one that we are probably almost familiar with. This is your standard kind of white women-centric feminism, talking about suffragettes, from Mary Wollstonecraft to Simone de Beauvoir. This feminism, has a particular focus on legal reform and increasingly pluralism. It's a focus on what women find empowering. We should be facilitating them engaging in those kinds of activities in that sense. This is, one that I think mostly we will all be familiar with. The second is, radical feminism, and this provides a lot of the theoretical material for feminist theory. Its leaders would be considered, people from the 60s and 70s and 80s as well, leaders such as Germaine Greer and Betty Friedan. And they really centered the patriarchy as responsible for the structural oppression of women through things like sexual objectification, for example, or gender roles, things like that. And it's interesting, actually, because this branch is subject to a lot of criticism at the moment, because they have refused to align with the demands made by the trans lobby. And you've actually got this term now, TERFs, T-E-R-F, Trans Eradicating Radical Feminists. And most people may have heard of this term because J.K. Rowling, obviously the author of Harry Potter, is subject to a lot of criticism for being an alleged TERF, because she has spoken out about, and she's expressed her concerns about how the trans lobby can be threatening to women's safety by basically allowing anyone and everyone to identify as a woman whenever they see fit. This strand of feminism can also be a critique of liberalism. So obviously, while we will talk about feminism as kind of a modern project that stems out of kind of a liberal paradigm, it's not to say that there aren't criticisms within that as well. We also have then Marxist or socialist feminism, and this has a fair amount in common with radical feminism, but it's specifically focused on looking at how capitalism exploits women. Third world feminism, or to use what would be the more politically correct term today, post-colonial feminism, is a branch that seeks to decenter Western culture in feminist theory. And this is probably a more critical current because it questions the unity of women that previous feminisms, particularly liberal feminism, assumed. And it essentially combines the fight against the patriarchy with the fight against Western hegemony. And it's also a lot more conscious of racial and religious biases that are inherent in many aspects to liberal feminism. And some of the and this has led some of the statements or stereotypes of liberal feminism about other countries do not really reflect the realities in these formerly colonized states. So for example, you'll see kind of Black feminism as something that it overlaps with very heavily in talking about the particular struggles faced by Black women in the West and also in the global South, as it's called. So ecofeminism, so I put this in as a bit of a laugh. It's a bit of a favorite of mine, purely because it's quite different to the previous schools mentioned in that it's a feminism of a more spiritual bent. Its basic tenet is that a patriarchal society will exploit natural resources without regard to the long-term consequences. And so the oppression of the environment and the oppression of women are intertwined. However, really, this current is very much criticized for essentializing women because it alleges that women are naturally closer to nature because of things like childbirth and the menstrual cycle and things like that. Other kind of questionable practices like tree hugging or vegetarianism may also be involved. So for all intents and purposes, it's written off as it's largely written off as a serious feminist school, although it does feature in regional feminist struggles. And regional feminisms are ultimately things that have emerged to discuss more particular struggles. So for example, African feminism is going to look more particularly at the realities African women are facing. Similarly with other kinds of feminism that we see in places in the Middle East or elsewhere, it sometimes draws on scholarship that is indigenous to these places and is really trying to kind of center those women's experiences a little more. Now, this is not a comprehensive list of all types of feminism, but I think it is important to recognize from this that feminism is not a monolith. But beyond that, I think we should recognize as well that feminism has made the experiences of women visible. The sexism that women faced in the Western world in the 50s, 60s, and 70s is not a reality for us today, thanks to feminism. You'll have, non-Muslim traditionalists looking back on this time, particularly the 50s and 60s, as a time when they say the nuclear family was allegedly thriving. In reality, it was only thriving for white people, but they ignore the fact that in this country, for example, women could not own their own bank account into the 70s. In Ireland, women could not own their own home until 1976. You could get fired from your job for getting pregnant, like, no questions asked, there was nothing you could do about it. And this is really no longer a reality for women in the West because women did lead those struggles and did push to get legislation changed and societal expectations changed. In addition to that, feminism can provide useful critiques of modernity and imperialism. I mean, Marxist and post-colonial feminism, as I said, both make significant scholarships to this area because they look at the relationship between global capitalism and Western hegemony and how this results in direct enslavement for women in developing countries, whether that's women in India working in sweatshops for a pittance, or women in the Philippines who are leaving their own children uncared for in order to come to the West and be nannies and maids for women and care for other children. So these different theoretical premises, I think, we should recognize them. Having said that, you find increasingly today that people cite the existence of these different feminisms as a way to argue that it's almost an abstract concept that can be defined as you wish. And so what this results in is that you have people putting forward extremely personal definitions of feminism. And this is something that I think many Muslims also do, that they say Islam is feminist to them. And I think the fact that they've said it is enough for it to be considered so, that because they find it empowering, nobody can question them on that. But really, from an academic standpoint, this is disingenuous to feminism. It robs feminism of having any normative position, of taking any concrete stance on what women's rights look like. And scholars of this discipline would push back against that. Many of them, I think many of them would, and they do. The same way that, for example, as I said, ecofeminism is largely considered defunct and not taken extremely seriously by many scholars because of the statements it makes about women and equality. There are people who would push back against that. So the crux of this issue now is feminism a neutral paradigm that we can mold to our specific understanding of women's liberation? Is it a term that anyone can claim, or are there foundational principles that for us as Muslims would clash with Islam? And even if, as we have acknowledged, there is a lot that we can learn from feminist analysis, what are the limits to our engagement with it? So to answer this question in more detail, I want to take a bit of time here to look at the contributions of Islamic feminism. And here I'm referring to the academic strand that is promoted by figures such as Amina Wadud. Even in this camp, there are disagreements. However, broadly speaking, this is a group of scholars who are attempting to reconcile Islam with underlying feminist assumptions. And I think it's important to look at their work in relation to this because arguably they are being consistent to the principles of feminism in their work. Right? This is academic research and they're experts in this field. This is not the same as somebody else just saying, I believe that this is feminist. They have to prove it. So I want us to understand how, when we take feminist precepts to their logical conclusions, what do we arrive at in relation to Islam? What does that look like? If indeed feminism is this neutral framework, can the two be reconciled? Now, before I start, I'd like to make it clear as well here that I'm not implying at all that the majority of women who identify as Muslim feminists ascribe to the views of this school. To be honest, it's the complete opposite. I'm not saying that at all, and I am going to come later on to talk about what feminism looks like in the Muslim community and why we have that. Rather, I want us to have an academic discussion here to examine how scholars of feminist theory have tried to reconcile Islam and feminism. Okay, so Islamic feminism as a scholarly endeavor today is led by figures such as Amina Wadud, Asma Barlas, who's Pakistani, Keisha Ali, who's an American, and Leila Ahmed, who's Egyptian, among several others. And again, they're not always in exact agreement with one another, but their fundamental aims in trying to establish an egalitarian Islam is the same. The approaches that they use are also often similar. They tend to use a very kind of modern hermeneutical approach towards Islamic texts. So their method of interpretation is not that which has been formulated by previous scholars. They generally express skepticism towards the authority of transmitted knowledge. Rather, they approach this with their own methodology that they usually outline before kind of explaining their conclusions. They tend to focus on the Quran, often because generally because they do disregard the hadith tradition and subsequent fiqh as being the result of patriarchal societies. But even in relation to the Quran, they acknowledge that this is not a feminist text, and rather they argue that the Quran can be read in multiple modes, and that a feminist meaning must be extracted from it. And they justify this by the idea that human limitations of language mean we cannot understand God's will. And so we need constant reevaluation of the text to make it applicable to our reality, rather than us stating that this is what God wants. In their overview of Islamic history, they also differentiate between an ethical Islam that they believe is advocated in the Quran and the hierarchical, patriarchal, version of Islam that they believe emerged during the Abbasid period. And this affected the production of tafsir and fiqh in their view. So for this reason, they argue that we need to historicize and recognize the intrinsic misogyny in the development of the Islamic corpus and reject things that do not conform with our modern sensibilities. In all of this, many feminists, they do claim that they are aware of the dangers of catering to the Western gaze in their analysis. And some of them do recognize as well, for example, that cultural differences and histories affect how things like modesty is seen. And so some of them do back the idea of hijab. if it's recognized as a choice and not an obligation. This is the camp that's kind of more Amina Wudu than Asma Barlas. This is the camp they're in. Others advocate for a more radical rethinking of how Islam approaches gender. And Keisha Ali and Aisha Hidayatullah, they are the ones kind of in this camp. So despite these claims to remove either pre-modern or Western biases towards Muslim women and Islam, this strand of scholarship actually very often fails to acknowledge their own presumptions with which they approach Islamic texts. This is first off very evident in their definitions of equality. So their definitions vary either between strict sameness, which renders Islamic rulings that differentiate between men and women inherently oppressive. Asma Barlas mentions an alternative definition of equality in her book, Believing Women in Islam. And she kind of states here that equality should be given as the context demands. This is extremely vague language and basically leaves people's definitions of equality up to whatever mainstream society has told them is justifiable and has told them that this is the way forward. So they fail to really kind of make a concrete definition in either of these usages. Equality is also sometimes articulated as agency, and by here we mean choice, right? And this is why we see an emphasis on choice when it comes to Islamic obligations like the hijab, for example. But this focus on choice actually betrays a very modern projection onto the past. And this is something that I know Dr. Anjum talked about last week when he was addressing liberalism, and he mentioned that philosophically and empirically, choice has been disproven as actually a genuine arbiter, or something that is kind of unanimous across all societies. And another example of work like this has been done by an anthropologist called Layla Abu Lughud. She has a book called Saving Muslim Women. And so in relation to Muslim women in particular, she criticizes this idea of consent being the definitive marker of something that is fair. Her analysis of Muslim societies demonstrates that when it comes to decision-making, there is actually a much more complex field of financial incentives, community expectations, and even socio-political dynamics that govern choice. So ultimately, this suggests that even choice, as we understand it, is socially constructed in a way. And this has pushed scholars more recently to think about how useful consent is when you look at relationships in different historical and different regional contexts in the Muslim world. Modern subjectivities, modern biases are also evident in feminists' insistence that even if sexual differentiation exists in Islam, it should not recognize gender differences. And really, if this had been proposed in any other era other than the modern day, it would have been laughed at by any scholar, Western or otherwise, because it's only been in the past 50 to 70 years that there's been this differentiation made between sex and gender very authoritatively. I mean, Simone de Beauvoir's book was in the 1970s was something that changed the way in which people thought about this. Otherwise, every society has treated men and women differently, whether that's for good or bad. So to insist that Islam not distinguish based on gender in things such as dress, again fails to acknowledge that this assumption is a very modern projection onto the past. Similarly, in defining patriarchy, rather than these feminist scholars recognizing areas that classical Islamic opinions may have been influenced by more male-centric readings on certain issues, instead they read the entire of Islamic history as irrevocably patriarchal. And dominant discourses of modernity are really to blame here, because they present history as this battle between masculine domination over the world versus those that are subjugated by it. And this is not only disingenuous, but it feeds, as many of these points do, into a fundamental axiom of modern liberal thought, namely that progress is the dislocation of tradition, the equating of tradition with backwardness and the future with progress, so that in order to arrive at truth, we have to erase all of what came before and reinterpret in light of the superior knowledge that we have attained now, which is really an incredibly arrogant assumption when you think about it. But Dr. Shuruq Najib, who is a lecturer in the UK, makes this point very eloquently in her book chapter, where she challenges Asma Barlas's allegations that classical scholars were misogynistic in relation to the verses on menstruation. And she writes that these academics are ultimately trying to limit the Quran's universalism, but they fall prey to the universalizing influences of liberalism. So these assumptions point to the feminist paradigm that while diverse, it's not as value-free as some may presume. And whilst I don't have time to go into full evaluation today, I want to mention a little bit here about how these assumptions actually lead to many methodological inconsistencies, which really shows the limitations of using feminist analysis to understand some things in the Islamic tradition. So firstly, as we said, there is a clear dismissal on the part of these scholars of any kind of traditional Islamic scholarship. But on many occasions, this leads them to make claims that are clearly unsubstantiated to anyone with a basic knowledge of the Islamic sciences. So Asma Barlas, for example, claims that scholars read each ayah of the Quran in isolation, and that there was no effort to look at the text holistically or around any dominant subjects. And this really ignores several thematic tafsir written in the classical and the more modern period. They also ignore the study of urf, or analogy, in any kind of in any real substantial way. It might be mentioned, but they don't really act as though this was something that scholars took on board seriously when they developed fiqh. They ignore the existence of asbab al-nuzul, reasons for revelation, as a factor in tafsir analysis. Sometimes when you read these books, it's almost as though they have invented this idea of looking behind the text and seeing what are the circumstances in which this verse was revealed, as though no one has ever thought of that before. Instead, they cast scholars as simply literalists. Ijma'a is also something that is cast as a tool of quietism on the part of scholars, and there's very much a desire to show scholars as being on the side of politicians, which whilst we read Islamic history, we know there were times where that happened. It wasn't at all something that was the absolute norm or something that happened even for the majority of the time. And instead of then this traditional scholarship, because they've written it all off, they often have to turn to Orientalist or Western scholarship about the Muslim world, while failing to identify it as such and failing to really interrogate what those people were saying about Islam and the Muslim world, with their own stereotypes and biases that they were writing with. This brings me to kind of the second issue, which is probably the biggest issue with their methodology, which is their rejection of the hadith corpus. And this actually ends up backfiring on them by their own admission. Keisha Ali admits that by rejecting hadith, Muslim feminists cannot historicize the Quran as they intend. They want to find out about asbab al-nuzul, they want to find out about the reasons for revelation, but if you're going to disregard narrations that talk about the society of Muhammad ﷺ, that talked about events that were happening, then what can you do? So this is a contradiction that they themselves admit. Feminists also tend to make very generalized claims about the role of women during Islamic history. And whilst it was far from perfect, their refusal to acknowledge the areas in which women did progress or were comparatively better off compared to women in the West or in Europe speaks very much to their rigid definitions of equality and of justice. So for example, Layla Ahmed, she talks a lot about how Islamic laws in the classical period and the Ottoman era pertaining to inheritance and property ownership resulted in women very often being large landowners or having awqaf in their name that were run by staff that were also entirely women. And she acknowledges that this was different to the situation of women in Europe at the time. But at the same time, she refuses to acknowledge that Islamic civilization was anything other than oppressive to women. And in her conclusion, she actually says that women were considered inferior human beings. I don't know about you guys, but I find it hard to believe that women who were in charge of all of this wealth and property were considered inferior human beings at the same time. They also struggle with people who don't fit this, again, kind of paradigm and these definitions of equality in the way they have understood them. So for example, Zainab al-Ghazali, who is a Muslim woman who was part of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1950s and 60s, she is generally lumped into a category of Islamist women because she was somebody who was talking about women's liberation through Islam and talking about the rights that were given. And, she was part of Muslim political projects at the time. Layla Ahmed casts her as incoherent because she says, her definition of equality doesn't make sense, that she's talking about women's rights, but then she's also saying things like women should respect their husbands, or, she herself was married and was conscious of the obligations she had towards her husband and things like that. This really suggests their inability to expand their definition of female liberation or empowerment to anything other than the way in which they have defined equality, they have defined patriarchy, they have defined gender justice or gender differences. Much of feminist evaluation, lastly, also relies on redefining Islamic terms and concepts to meanings that are more suitable for the modern era. And this is problematic for many reasons, but it's most especially problematic when the people doing the redefining do not know Arabic. And this is the case of Asma Barlas, who states in the beginning of her book what translation of the Quran she is using. And she says that she likes this translation for XYZ reason. She refers as well to ijtihad in her book. She defines it as critical thinking, as opposed to an exercise in judicial reasoning that we would consider something that scholars have as a tool that scholars have to adjust to new realities. Sometimes as well, feminists refer to the fitra as evidence that men and women are fundamentally equal in all spheres. And this is patently not a definition of the fitra, as any small child learns when we talk about what these things are, and how young children have a fitra that endears them towards goodness, endears them towards the worship of one God, and things like that. So how strong can these arguments really be considered if people are simply going to adopt new definitions of words with little evidence that they've ever been considered in that light before, and state that, this is the new way in which we're going to understand this? So in short, the reason I'm mentioning these methodological inconsistencies is because these are very much the result of the assumptions by which these scholars start their evaluation of Islam. And it points to, again, the fact that this framework that they are using is not value-free. They have some certain definitions and they're trying to compare Islam to that. So after all of that, what does this lead to? Despite these methodological issues, despite these unacknowledged presumptions, do these scholars actually manage to reconcile Islam with feminist precepts? Do we have an Islam that, is just, okay, well, this means this, this means this, this means this, and everyone's like happy about it, and we can all take this alternative meaning? Not really. Obviously, these feminist scholars have an issue with fiqh, and some of them, like Keisha Ali, go as far as to advocate a complete rewriting of Islamic marital law and principles to make it more egalitarian. She doesn't think there's any hope for interpreting it in an equal light with the way it is. But even fiqh aside, there are many theological quagmires that feminists end up getting themselves into. This includes the denial of Quranic verses, as Amina Wadud has done in relation to the verse that allegedly provides a justification for wife beating. They also refuse to take inheritance laws as stipulated by the Quran as something that's relevant for today. So this is not a different interpretation. This is just saying no to the evidence that is there. And on top of this, then we see, people like Amina Wadud making statements that obviously would be considered abhorrent to Muslims, where you start attacking prophets for decisions that you view as unacceptable. And she infamously called Ibrahim alayhi salam, the friend of Allah, Khalilullah, a deadbeat dad, na'udhu billah, for leaving Hajar and Ismail in the deserts of Mecca, despite the fact that obviously this was something that was ordered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In their analysis overall, I think there is also a shocking lack of attention paid to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This for me is something that, it just says a lot about how these figures view Islam. Because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to, he could have revealed the Quran in the absence of Rasulullah. But he chose to reveal this through the messenger, through the best of mankind, in order to show us how it should be acted upon. He is our spiritual leader, and his commentary, his actions, his acceptance of different behavior, none of this can be detached from how we understand any aspect of Islam. And the fact that they are intentionally depriving themselves of the speech of our beloved, there can be no route to success through that ultimately. really what this conversation is aimed at doing is promoting an Islam that is based on ethics rather than any other underlying rules or obligations. It becomes very much about what we feel rather than linking our beliefs to actions or any kind of things that we have to do, which again fits into the new secularized religions that we observe today. And unsurprisingly, this leads to conclusions that are even more radical. It doesn't end at rejecting fiqh or hadith or ignoring Muhammad ﷺ or ignoring our obligations. It results in questioning the Quran itself. And Hidayatullah and Ali are both people in this camp where they advocate for a radical reassessment of the Quran's divinity and for it to be held accountable for its misogyny and the things that lead to problematic interpretations. They even go as far as to claim that the Quran isn't even an accurate representation of God's will. This is what the quote from Ali is saying here. So, I read this and I was just like, what is the point of even having this conversation? If we're going to start doubting that the Quran is even reflecting what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants, we might as well just all sit and think about it and make our own decisions. Just, leave the text alone. All of this effort has been for very, very little. So to conclude this section, what I've tried to do in this evaluation, although it's very brief, I've tried to show that feminism as a paradigm is not really a useful way to approach gender issues in Islam. Yes, it's not a monolith, and yes, it has some good criticisms and things that we can use to analyze our reality today, but it does have certain fundamental principles that when we take them to their logical conclusions, cannot explain the equality that even these women believe is outlined in the Quran. So rather than deciphering any genuine meaning, it's almost become a competition of who can read the most desirable meaning into the text and half justify it in some way. The crux of this questioning is actually how we understand Islamic texts themselves. And this is not a talk on usul al-fiqh, on the principles of fiqh, or how the study of Islam developed. But in approaching these questions, we would ultimately start from our sources themselves, namely how the Quran and Muhammad ﷺ taught us to approach the text. This is how usul developed. This does not mean that we cannot criticize previous writings of classical scholars. Rather, if we do, we need to be conscious of the methodology that we're adopting. Are we imposing modern norms onto historical texts or circumstances? Are we using foundational language or concepts that are external to the Quran? And on that note, I want us to think about, okay, if feminism is not a useful way of engaging with gender in Islam, how can we approach some of these controversial issues that we all hear about, that people talk about, involving women? Now, I do not claim that there is one answer to this question, but I have some thoughts on how we can contribute to some kind of gender discourse that is rooted in an Islamic framework and in a tradition of scholarship. And again, for the sake of time, I'm only going to go through these briefly. But the first is that, as I just said, we take the text as a starting point when it comes to our definitions of equality, of gender justice, of gender differences. And there are a couple of examples actually of Muslim women who, mashallah, do this very well. One is Dr. Tamara Gray, who wrote an article on the Yaqeen Institute website, which is about exploring femininity in the Quran. And on a similar note, Dr. Celine Ibrahim has a book called Women and Gender in the Quran, which looks at female archetypes as well, and how the Quran talks about stories involving women, how women are, or what are the things that women are praised for, what are things that we as Muslims are supposed to take lessons from these women, because obviously these stories are being given to us for a reason. Now, these are not fiqh books, and they're not giving any rulings per se, but really it shows how we can frame our understandings of gender based upon the Islamic sources themselves. The second is that we treat, or rather we take controversial issues where men and women are treated differently, holistically. When it comes to differences in inheritance, for example. First off, in the Hanafi school, women actually inherit more than men in 14 different circumstances. So though we always hear women receive, half of what men do, this is not always the case. But even then, when we are faced with a difference like that, we have to take into account that in Islam, it's the responsibility of menfolk to provide for their female relations. Where this is not possible, there are also allowances in the Sharia for wealth to be given by parents to their daughters in their lifetime, such that a woman could easily have more than her brother in terms of wealth and things that were passed down from her parents than her brother after her parents' death. So we need to kind of keep some of these things in mind when we're talking about controversial issues with women in Islam. There is also a need to accurately historicize Muslim societies. We talked about how feminists dismiss hadith due to the male-dominated, transmission chains, or the fact that the science apparently was developed entirely by men. And yet we've seen recently that, Sheikh Akram Nadwi has written, the biographies of 10,000 Muslim female hadith transmitters, al-muhaddithat, from the early period of Islam, who all took part in that effort to preserve hadith. So how do we explain their presence there? If their presence is there, are we saying that they were just completely subjugated by other men that they were teaching, and so they felt obliged to give a very patriarchal hadith or invent a hadith that was going to, ultimately disadvantage women in the long run? We need to start thinking about some of these claims a bit more critically. At the same time, having said that, I do think that we shouldn't shy away from recognizing where certain scholars may have been influenced by norms at their specific time to make certain problematic statements or exclusionary rulings. This applies to things like sexism and also to things like racism. I think an important example of this is the work of Sheikha Maryam Amir, who many people who follow her on her social media may know is running this For Mothers campaign, where she interrogates the idea that Muslim women are forbidden from reciting the Quran in front of men. And she has, mashallah, done a lot of work in this area and a lot of research into classical opinions on this. And she's starting to release the details now over her social media, but she highlights that there are differences of opinion on this issue. And certain opinions have gained strength, not always because of their textual strength, but because of the customary influences and expectations. So again, there is room for considered critique, even with these rulings that we are told, this is just the way it is. But again, within the bounds of our own tradition. Sorry, is my PowerPoint okay? I'm not 100% sure. I've just got a message on my screen. I'm not sure if the admin. Yep, okay. Inshallah. Still okay? Okay, alhamdulillah. So I think another thing that we have to do to really kind of counter the feminist approach to Islamic history and law is recognize that Islam's moral encouragement is supposed to be taken alongside the specific practical rulings that are being implemented. Rahmah, mercy, is the overarching framework in which we approach Islamic issues. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that He wants ease for us, not difficulty. So this is not a competition between fiqh and rahmah, the way in which feminists would state that the Quran is this ethical, easy life kind of approach to gender, and the fiqh is all about patriarchy. Fiqh is practiced in consideration of rahmah. This is why we have the maqasid as well, overall, the objectives of the sharia to guide fiqh and make sure that they are contributing to this overall project. And finally, I think we need to recognize the role and the renewed role today for considering urf, for considering custom. And also think about how ijtihad is important and seeking out people of expertise in certain issues. And I think that an example of this is Sheikh Yasir Qadi, who has stated in an article that he wrote that one area which Muslim jurists could perhaps pay attention to is alimony, right? Because this is something that Islamic law does not really cater for very much. And this perhaps stems from a reality where when Muslim women got divorced, they were able to go back to their families, their large families or clans or tribes for financial provision and protection. In the absence of that, perhaps this is something that we need to revisit, again, from our own methodology, but it's not us dismissing our tradition to just even raise this issue. There is space for engagement within the parameters set out by our usul and by our aqidah. And this is why I fundamentally believe we do need a gender discourse, particularly in this day and age, because of the challenges that we're facing externally, as we've spoken about thus far. But now, inshallah, I want to go on to talk about the challenges that we're facing internally as well. And again, why we need to think about having this kind of discourse and this space open for us as Muslim men and women to contribute. Okay, so yeah, feminism is theory done. And as I said in the beginning, that was about the limitations, the areas that we can take from feminist contributions, and the limits of using that framework to understand Islam. However, as I said at the beginning, I think that it's wholly wrong to assume that Muslim women identify as feminist or discuss feminism in the public sphere, that when they do so, they're referring to that kind of literature. Obviously, some are, but they are a vocal minority, without a doubt. And I would argue that most Muslim women who have adopted this term have done so in order to find a language that allows them to advocate for gender justice. And really, it's a term that has come to just mean, women's rights. And those who use it construct a definition based upon those values that reflects what they think about those issues, about women's rights, men's rights, gender equality. And so I think that when this argument is made, there is, some level of understanding. I think people do now hear a bit more, and some people, about the kinds of trials that Muslim women face, whether that's domestic violence or emotional and psychological abuse in marriage, or preferences being given to boys over girls, women being threatened with violence if they do not wear hijab when they don't understand it. I think, we can all point to that as wrong. And these are also very overt and very physical problems, and things that directly contradict Islam. Domestic violence, is haram. But I think that sympathy wanes for Muslim women who seem to use feminist terminology to articulate their concerns beyond some of these isolated issues. So without going into a huge amount of detail, I do want to mention and elaborate here on some of the other more controversial issues that Muslim women are raising and highlight why they're important for us to discuss. Okay, so the first, I think, is actually quite a big one for several sisters, in that they often feel frustrated in their inability to access Islamic knowledge or teachers on the same level that brothers do. And this is sometimes due to a problem of resources. Sometimes there is a genuine lack of Muslim women who have the ability and the time to teach. But more often than not, there is a reluctance on the part of masajid or community organizations to actively find and engage women to do this role. And this is not to say that every single mosque is equipped with a capable male scholar either. Of course, there are many problems with Islamic institutions and their ability to really provide for the community. But I would venture that having a woman on board is often seen as secondary. But even if there is no female scholar available, for example, rarely do we see, at least in the UK, never, mosques making an effort to have, for example, a sister's session with the imam to ask questions. And this poses many problems, not least because, for example, when women are going through marital difficulties or divorce, they don't know who to ask. They don't know who to ask for help. They can ask, anonymously on, a TV show, for example, where they have the imam asking questions on Islamic TV channels, but that's not the same as somebody actually intervening in your marriage and giving you advice and helping you because they know you very well. But I think when many people, they would argue that these kinds of initiatives, like female scholarship or having scholars cater to women directly, are not necessary thanks to the internet. They say that there are enough resources out there for Muslim women to learn about Islam, and if they want to ask a question, then they can submit a question to an Islamic website or to a TV channel, as I said. And this completely disregards the fact that studying Islam should really not be undertaken in isolation. I mean, we've just looked at people who study Islam devoid of mentorship and often devoid of any kind of real, traditional instruction, and the conclusions that can lead them to. So having a mentor is important, not only to understand the content that we're reading, but also to facilitate that spiritual development. So saying, Muslim women study themselves or listen to lectures online really is the second best solution and doesn't deal with the problem that having somebody in the community that women can learn from and ask questions to is very important for a multitude of reasons. Secondly, access to communal Muslim spaces. This is something that is very pertinent in the UK and has been raised just recently with Ramadan starting, and a lot of mosques that have opened for Tarawih to men, but not for women. And there are also many instances where mosques lack spaces entirely for sisters, and even in emergency circumstances have turned sisters away or prevented them from praying on site. Having said that, I have heard that it can happen, of instances where this has happened in the US as well. And the other day I was reading a story of a sister in Australia who, when she raised this issue at the mosque that she's been attending for 17 years, the mosque actually just threatened to ban her altogether. And so she had to, state a public apology that she was sorry that she had asked for space for Muslim women to pray Tarawih. Ultimately, this issue takes a hadith that should serve as a mercy to sisters by stating the reward of them praying at home, and turns it into a way to ban women from the mosque, which actually there is a hadith against. Yeah, that we know that there is a hadith that says do not ban women from the masjid. And this again deprives women of all of the benefits of communal worship, of the atmosphere, of meeting other Muslim women, especially in areas where there are not necessarily very big Muslim communities. And this is actually very far from the reality in much of the Muslim world, particularly in some areas, we see the complete opposite. So it very much is a cultural problem that people are trying to dress up in Islamic terminology or in fiqh opinions. Gender stereotypes. Okay, this is obviously a huge topic that we don't have time to go into now, but suffice to say that understandings, often culturally informed understandings of what modesty is, have framed entire expectations of women. Many women are prevented from engaging in sports, even in female-only environments, because it's perceived as immodest. Women, I know several sisters who fast in Ramadan even when they are menstruating. And, they don't just not eat in front of their family, that's a personal choice. They get up for suhoor. They pretend to pray Fajr in Jama'ah with their family, because confessing that actually I don't have to fast because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given me this reason is considered immodest. Muslim women speaking publicly, not just as I'm doing now, but even, I've gone to events where I've even just tried to ask speakers, male speakers, questions. It's seen as unnecessary, and people who want to do that are sometimes labeled as immodest or think they must have some kind of, again, feminist agenda to want to ask a question directly to the speaker, submit it in writing and get an answer 3 days later. I think there's also a lot of racism and cultural stereotypes that are tied up as well in these understandings of modesty. And this often gives way as well to ideas of women's inherent passivity, of women being more emotional or being endlessly nurturing or endlessly merciful. And ultimately what narrowing women and femininity down to these characteristics does is that it serves to exclude women who do not exactly fit these characteristics. So deeming women as not feminine for not fitting this certain archetype hardly, again, endears people who have different personality traits towards Islam as a religion for all. Okay, women being held to higher standards. I mean, this occurs not only at an individual level in households, for example, but what I'm talking about here is on a communal level. When a female influencer or a hijabi blogger does something that contradicts Islamic adab, for example, we can always expect the reaction to be much bigger than it is for men who do equivalent, things that are, again, not in line with Islam. And it's not just kind of the condemnation of it, but it's the persistent harassment that many of these women have experienced, where, again, I'm speaking to the UK context, but I'm sure kind of people would have examples from other places as well. You have certain male influencers or YouTubers making video after video about this Muslim woman who has done XYZ. And this, seems endless sometimes when you're seeing that just it's not one video, there's not two, there's three, and sort of multiple videos being reduced in a day sometimes. It's incredibly traumatic for those involved, and it's also traumatic for all of the women who witness it. For the women who see that the followers of these individuals are being directed to leave, negative comments or offensive remarks and in the comment sections, when you're scrolling down that as a woman and thinking, well, I'm a bit like this person, this blogger, this influencer, they could be saying that about me. It, again, that trauma transcends the screen, right? Even if it's not about you directly. But ultimately, what does it say about our respect for women that we are so keen to condemn them? And, I've done a lot of talks and a lot of work in relation to influencer culture and hijabi bloggers and many of the problems that these things bring. But at the end of the day, they're our sisters in Islam. And we can't be tackling these kinds of issues in a way that's going to push people further away from the deen. the career woman versus housewife dichotomy. So this is a big issue that perhaps we can revisit in the Q&A, but it's also something we recently wrote about on the Qarawiyyin Project. But essentially, we see that in this conversation, rather than directing our criticism towards working practices that are making family life hard for men and women, we increasingly see that people are expressing their preference for their personal life in religious terms. So being a housewife is equated with being traditional and so more religious, while women who engage in a certain profession are conceptualized as being more modern and so un-Islamic. And this essentially ignores that women, like men, very often want to do more than one thing in their life, and they want to do different things at different parts of their life. You know, I don't know any Muslim woman who, however studied she is, or however long she is engaged in her profession, who wants to sacrifice her family or her personal life for the sake of her career. I'm not saying that those women don't exist, but I would say that often this is a stereotype about people who have committed to certain projects and certain jobs. But rather than actually looking at the realities of parenthood and looking at working life and the kinds of demands that are being made and how we can navigate that, what we instead choose to do is label people based on what are very individual and nuanced choices at the end of the day, particularly when, you know, family finances and things like that are considered. In terms of female role models, what I'm referring to here is kind of efforts made by Muslim women to have female representation on event panels or masjid boards or organizational committees, etc. And whilst obviously I think demands that there be 50-50 representation are somewhat unnecessary, the importance of having visible Muslim women to serve as examples as to what the next generation can do really cannot be overstated. And it's strange that this is such an issue of controversy, because there's so much complaining and disappointment in the community, in mosques or organizations or on social media, with people complaining that why are Muslim women going into certain professions, particularly those related around like fashion and beauty. But then there's a reluctance to showcase women in other positions. How can we blame people for not being inspired when we aren't providing the inspiration? This is something that I think, you know, it'd be quite easy to address if we actually considered it in this way. I think the next one can be quite a sensitive topic. It's something that continually rears its head, as even we've seen since the start of Ramadan, more allegations about public figures who, you know, I'm sure we all may have heard of. I mean, the fact that we still have leaders in our community who have admitted, I'm not even talking about allegations here, who have admitted to illicit or inappropriate relationships, who are still able to continue speaking and teaching about Islam, is really quite mind-boggling. What this tells women is that their safety is not important, that the prestige of a certain individual eclipses concerns over their welfare. So again, how does this incline people to give leadership and give respect to those who claim to represent Islamic knowledge? You know, again, I'm talking about cases as well where even if people haven't admitted to it, the evidence is quite clear. And no one is saying, you know, we need to go and implement the had on this person. They've been accused of something. We're just going to go straight away and, like, you know, implement the Sharia on them. I'm not talking about that. But if someone has been accused of it and you have a significant amount of evidence proving that, at the very least, just suspend relations with these individuals until something is established. But how is it that we have people who are accused of rape still being invited to lead salah and, you know, recite Quran? Again, this is just really not acceptable when you think about it. But beyond kind of those particular like power dynamic relationships of abuse and spiritual abuse and things like that, I think there is also a failure to recognize the extent of abuse that Muslim women face in general. You know, even if they're not being particularly groomed, the harassment that Muslim women face, be it on the street or online, and I'm talking about from Muslims in this sense, from Muslim men, is unfortunately endemic. Last month in the UK, we had a very high profile kidnap and murder of a woman by a police officer, a non-Muslim woman. And in the aftermath of this, you know, there was a lot of protests on the streets of the UK, and many Muslim women also came together to share their stories of harassment and feeling unsafe on the streets on social media. And it was incredibly disappointing to see that many of these women were talking about feeling more unsafe in Muslim populated areas than in areas that have a higher proportion of non-Muslims. So seeing these, hundreds literally of Muslim women talking about these experiences, I decided to ask on social media, ask brothers in particular, if they had attended any Islamic event or talk or khutbah in which this issue was raised. Now, obviously, this is not any kind of scientific test. I'm not trying to get a statistic based on this, and I only have a above average, just a little above average following on social media. So I'm not trying to make too many generalized claims. But I did get, alhamdulillah, a lot of responses. The vast majority of them were negative. People hadn't attended an event where this was mentioned. And some people, they just said that they talked about it with some of their friends in like a private halaqah session or something like that, but it had never been on the agenda. But more disappointing than this were people who tried to justify why this was not the case. Yeah, there were some people who were saying, oh, this isn't the place to discuss that, whether it was the khutbah or any other kinds of halaqah or something like that. And a couple of people said, oh, they'd heard lectures about treating women well or treating their wives and daughters well. What does treating your family members well have to do with not catcalling women on the street? I'm sure that the people who do that are nice to their mothers and their sisters and their wives and their daughters as well. But just because, again, like treat women well as though this is just kind of an easy statement, if we just do it, it's something, again, tick box, oh, we treated women well today. We need to, again, have a bit more of a nuanced conversation. Which women are we talking about? Which circumstances are we talking about? What does treating women well actually mean? And not just kind of say, well, I heard a lecture about, treating your wife nicely, because that's not really talking about this issue of, of harassment at all. And I think perhaps, some of the lack of awareness about this issue does result in a lot of as well casual sexism that we see from figures in the Muslim community. And this is something that I know causes a lot of resentment among Muslim women that I've spoken to at various other events or community meetings or, sisters I know personally. When you have figures using dehumanizing language towards Muslim women, when you have people calling them females, this was a post I recently saw. You talk about females in relation to a female cat, or a female horse, or a female cow. You don't think about females like repeatedly talking about these females when you're talking about women. What that does is it leads to a very dehumanized portrayal of the people you're talking about. And, it's also been sometimes disappointing that you see when da'is or debaters, disagree with women, or they are talking about a particular woman they don't like, perhaps she's an Islamophobe or whatever, very often they'll comment on her appearance or her weight or her body. And there was recently an incident where I saw one brother tell this woman that she should wear niqab, basically trying to infer that she is ugly, therefore she should wear niqab. And this was particularly shocking, because what does this say to your opinion of Muslim women who wear niqab? You think you're insulting this woman, you're insulting Muslim women. And when a couple of sisters tried to kind of approach him on that and say, I don't think you should reconsider that statement, they encountered very sexualized abuse and comments from some of his supporters. So again, what we're seeing is that when people in certain positions of power or authority do that, they're given a green light to the people who respect them to do similar things, who won't discern whether is this person an Islamophobe, is it a Muslim woman, is it a non-Muslim woman? Again, it's not acceptable any of the time, but there's even less discernment, is my point. And finally, genuine confusions over the position of women in Islam. It's very unsettling how this conversation is sometimes conducted, because rather than speaking more broadly about the gender justice Islam facilitates, it's all about the obligations Muslim women must do, how you will be cursed by the angels for not doing XYZ, how we are allegedly lacking in intelligence and faith, how our testimony is not equal to a man's, how a man can get a second wife without even asking, the permission. He doesn't have to ask the permission of his first wife. I'm seeing concubines mentioned increasingly by people. I'm getting questions about concubines from other sisters, which is, a historical phenomena that's not even applicable now, and yet it's being consistently mentioned. Rather than empowering women through Islam, it's almost that this is kind of a test of their faith, that if I present Islam to you in the worst possible way, is your submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enough to take it? And if you don't, if you express discomfort at any aspect of this presentation, then you haven't fully submitted to Allah. And I'm wary of making too many assumptions here, but really this kind of behavior, when you see it repeatedly, points to people involved in that as deriving some kind of satisfaction by presenting men as, quote unquote, powerful, in power, or dominant. The idea that Muslim women must know their place and we must put them there. And you see this as well with subtle pushback against certain initiatives that empower women through Islam. I know that when Sheikh Akram published Al-Muhaddithat, there were certain people who were very much contesting his inclusion of women in this, saying that some of them were not actually, muhaddithas. They were just people who, related it. Some of them had ijazas from when they were 11. It doesn't count. And eventually, Sheikh Akram did issue a response about this, which, as somebody who is not versed in the hadith sciences, I won't try and explain. But he essentially said that this is an argument that you could apply to many other books of male narrators as well, where people fail to make this distinction. And he's not claiming that every single one of these women was an incredible hadith scholar, but the point is they played a role in the preservation of the hadith science. This is something that we see at the Qarawiyyin Project as well, where it's almost sometimes like people are waiting to catch you out. They're waiting for you to show your true feminist colors and prove that actually, all of what you're saying can't be taken seriously because, we're waiting for you to say it like that or to put that spin on it. So kind of moving on from these issues, this is not supposed to be an exhaustive list, but these are issues that I'm trying to show are actually legitimate things to raise from an Islamic perspective. And yet Muslim women are frequently being labeled as feminist for raising these problems. And it's funny because there's really no limits to that term being used. Sometimes people would like to turn around and say, well, look at the people who are making those statements. They're not practicing people. They're actually also campaigning for, LGBT rights. And they are, people who are advocating for the reform of Islam. So that's why we're calling them feminists. That's why we're shutting these calls down. But actually, legitimacy is not given to Muslim women who are visibly religious or have traditional qualifications either. I mean, I've spoken to female scholars who talk about how they, despite having, dedicated their life to the study of Islam, despite having, ijazat, despite having memorized the Quran, their efforts to strengthen women's connection to the deen by talking about some of these issues are labeled as feminists. So for many Muslim women, you see no escape. When you try and express your concerns through Islam, you're still ousted. So where exactly are you supposed to turn? And I think something I would like to kind of raise here that I was thinking about is that it's incredibly unfortunate that you don't hear the voices of male scholars in this issue as much as you should. These are conversations that are happening in public, or even sometimes on private groups. I've been on private groups where there are scholars present. And when it's time to attack the Salafis or attack the Sufis, then they'll be commenting and making sure that everybody knows their perspective on it. When it's time for somebody to defend their friend's organization from some accusations that are being leveled at it, then we can expect pages and pages of reasons as to why this is not the case. But when it's time to clarify an issue that Muslim women are feeling very anxious about, that is making them feel very uncomfortable, that people have this perception or are edging towards very extreme views, it's pin drop silence. And I think that is incredibly disappointing and something I'd really like to see change. Because in the past 6 months alone, I cannot count the number of Muslim women who I have seen say that they want to take a step back or have entirely exited the Muslim community. And this should be a huge source of sadness because we are losing the contributions and the expertise of these women. We are not able to benefit them, to benefit from what they have to offer because they see these spaces as very hostile to them. So moving forward, whilst I know I dedicated probably a little bit more time today to the academic aspect of today's talk, this latter part is where I really fundamentally believe our action as a community should be focused. We need to be open to a gender discourse and not just dismiss everyone who is raising these issues as feminist and not just dismiss these issues by saying Islam is the solution. Saying Islam is perfect, people are not, is a completely inadequate response to somebody who is receiving injustice. It's like students who are having to sit an exam with a bad teacher. If those students raise their complaints to the exam board or the head teacher or whoever it is, and say that we don't feel understanding the course because this teacher is really bad, if the exam board turn around and say, well, the curriculum's perfect, how does that change the fact that those students are having a bad teacher and they're not understanding the content? Yeah, so we need to kind of think a little bit more deeply about how we respond to these situations and not just dismiss them. We need to be open about recognizing new realities that mandate us to think about how, the cultural preferences that are expressed in some of our Islamic institutions can adapt. And we need to actually direct resources, I think, to this, whether that's through financial resources or through qualified people towards these kinds of issues. And I think it's crucial that we don't simply see this kind of, what I'm suggesting as a response to feminism. That, oh, sisters are turning to feminism because of the problems in the community, let's fix the community. That may or may not be true, but actually this is an Islamic duty in and of itself. Catering to half of the Muslim population who will raise the entire Muslim population is actually something that is part of our deen. This is not just a response to a trend. We need to center it as something much more fundamental than that. This is what it is. This is what it means to embody where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Tawbah, وَالْمُؤْمِنُونَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ, that the believing men and women are allies of one another. Allies is not like this, feminist terminology that, oh, you're an ally of women. No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us that we're allies of one another before anybody else coined this term. And I think that's what's going back to what we were saying in the beginning, how I started my introduction about where this topic goes wrong, is that we can't be intellectually lazy about this conversation. We can't have knowledge phobia and just refuse to engage with new realities. We need to be open to reevaluating and furthering Islam. So our engagement with these gender issues needs to be conceptualized as tajdeed, as renewal, not liberalization. So to conclude, and I know that I've spoken for a very long time, if there's one thing I really want anyone listening to take away from this, it's that we really need to stop labeling without understanding. It's that feminism is extremely overused as a word, and that unless you're going to define what you mean by it, or other people are self-identifying with that term, I would really recommend that people think before using it. I think we need to stop hiding behind the dangers of feminism or the perfection of the tradition as an excuse to avoid broaching these nuanced and difficult conversations on gender issues. And this is the only way that, inshallah, we can put the time and the effort in that's required to create this discourse, inshallah, and work towards gender justice. Those efforts will require a very participatory approach. I think you have to include Muslim women in this. We have to listen to their concerns and their proposed solutions. Again, not because this is how we stop women going towards feminism, however you may define that, but because engaging Muslim women is really fundamental to our progress as an ummah. So inshallah, I'll leave it there. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. And I will stop sharing this, inshallah.
Jazakallah khairan, Sister Aisha, for the wonderful talk. It's always a pleasure listening to your insights, be it on the Qarawiyyin podcast or through opportunities like this. So with that, we'll be moving into the question and answer session. A quick reminder to please submit your question to the moderator named Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we can, inshallah. So the first question is, what are some steps that Muslims can take to move away from polemical and sloganistic discourse that surrounds feminism? Does it require a greater access to text critiquing feminism and a greater Islamic literacy?
Okay, bismillah. Definitely, I think that's part of it. I mean, again, as we said, engaging with knowledge, whether that's Islamic knowledge or other people's, critiques of feminism, because there are critiques from feminism that stem from kind of secular academic sciences as well. I think that's definitely important. I think as well, in terms of how we address this issue, it really depends. I think that if something particular has happened, somebody has made, a particular statement that, I'm not going to as well pretend that we don't have people in the Muslim community who do use feminist discourse to outright reform Islam. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. So definitely where there are instances of that, we shouldn't shy away from critiquing that. But I think it's about us making sure that we just use that term feminism correctly and really identify and define clearly what we mean by that. So many of these things, lie in definitions. And I don't know, as I've got more into these conversations and I've gotten older, you really see the wisdom in, for example, at university, when you write essays, how you have to define every single thing before you actually start to discuss it. I think we need to if we take that approach and then definitely draw on more sources, whether that's Islamic or, quote unquote secular, then that's definitely, inshallah, good steps forward to making the discussion more substantial and more nuanced.
So the next question, Great discussion, Sister Aisha. Could you shed light on the fact that radical feminists try to put down homemakers / the role of motherhood? They focus on women having careers, which can cause women without careers to feel less powerful. How should Muslim women deal with that?
Yeah, no, definitely. That's a really good question and a really good point. I mean, when you look at kind of how radical feminism, and FYI as well, before I start this, I don't claim that I'm an expert in other kinds of feminism. So if other people, inshallah, want to share their contributions about those things, then absolutely, please feel free. But when you see about how radical feminism emerged in the kind of 50s and 60s, I think a cornerstone of radical feminism is that patriarchy manifests itself not just in the public sphere, but in the private sphere. And so employment and having financial independence is presented as a way of women being able to escape that sphere. And there's also a lot of literature on how when women earn money, their bargaining power in the relationship is heightened. And so the drive to actually get women into work was because they wanted to help women kind of equalize what they saw as the very patriarchal institution of marriage. And, you know, we can talk about how, again, some aspects of this might be true. I mean, my background is international development, and I know that when you are looking at, for example, trying to provide aid to people in poverty, if you give women the aid, they are more likely to spend it on their children and on the welfare of the whole household versus husbands. This is not to paint men in a negative light. I'm not saying men are selfish or things like that. I'm just talking about trends that have been observed and the kind of considerations and the societal expectations even that people have of women that means they're more likely to behave in this way. So, okay, that's a trend that we can identify and we can talk about, and policymakers can think about, okay, how are we going to use this? But that is a far cry from insinuating that Muslim women need to work in order to escape the patriarchy of the home. Yeah. Obviously, Islamic laws regarding marriage and relationships and things like that, some of them, they always need to be practiced anyway with rahmah and things like that in consideration. But the fact of the matter is as well that we know that men have been given this responsibility of being a qawwam over their family. And we shouldn't think that, well, when men aren't fulfilling that, therefore, you know, women have to. And I'm not saying that if you're in that situation, if your husband or somebody you know is not being a qawwam in your relationship, the women should just sit at home and just wait until they do. If you're in that situation, you have to act and you have to go out to work, for example, if your husband is not providing. And I see very regularly, and I hear about cases like that. But when we're talking about Islamically, you know, as a principle, a guiding principle for society, it shouldn't just be that men aren't fulfilling their responsibility, then women step up. We need to make men fulfill their responsibility in that sense. And so the drive to therefore get women out into the workplace in order to combat that is, you know, misguided, because we're not focusing our attention on the people who are actually doing the wrong. And, you know, if women choose to work at different points in their life, or they choose to work in a way that fits their family life, there's a huge conversation we could have about that, but that's their choice. But the idea that women should have to work because they need freedom from this patriarchal system, or that their work in the home is not as valuable compared to what they can contribute outside to the GDP of this country, is something that definitely from an Islamic basis we would not consider, because we do have the evidence that Islam values motherhood and the emphasis that it puts on it as a cornerstone of society, the reward that you get, that, you know, Muhammad said that, you know, Jannah is under the feet of your mother. This is a path to Jannah, serving your mother, because mothers are so valued for their work in the home and the effort that they put into raising their children and looking after their families. So anything that tries to devalue that is something that we need to be conscious of. And definitely where women are either forced to work because you know, men are not stepping up to the table, in that sense at least, that needs to be corrected with men, not by, you know, forcing women into you know, the workplace and making them sacrifice other things which are very much many women's priorities. If that makes sense.
The next question is a clarification question. Could you repeat the point about the usage of the word female?
Yeah, so this was essentially a post that I observed by somebody who, I'm not here to name names at all of anybody today, but I'm sure that people would know of him if I did refer to him, who in a conversation about Muslim feminists repeatedly referred to them, not even as feminists, which has become a slur word in and of itself, but as females. These females believe that XYZ, these kinds of females think that this is what should be done. We need to respond to these females. And language plays a huge part of how we conceptualize the world around us with everything. And it's why we hear so much from many of our scholars about how we need to be careful of the language that we're using when we talk about the Islamic tradition. Even when we talk about things like Islam being a religion, it plays into our minds of this are very secularized private religions that we have today, like Hinduism and Christianity and Buddhism as just being something that we focus on in the private sphere. Whereas we know that deen, the word deen, actually has so much more meaning than that. It can be interpreted in various places in the Quran as system, as sovereignty, as a path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as a way of life. And this really reflects the beauty of our deen in all areas, such that it's given guidance for social organization, political organization, environmental protection. These are the things that we talk about. So language is incredibly important. And definitely when we see figures using certain kinds of language to describe women, that definitely affects. I have seen it personally, and I don't just want to make this anecdotal, like I said, but there are many, many impacts that we can see from labeling and from labeling women with certain terms, whether that's feminist or whether it's something like females.
The next question is, do you think Muslim women who are part of this conversation should identify themselves with feminism, a version defined within the Islamic text, or is this something that we should actively avoid?
I think this is interesting because, as I said, feminism just means so many different things to different people. So I know some sisters who would say, yeah, I'm a feminist, and I know that their meaning is not as some of the people who we've discussed earlier today, but it's that, Islam talks about rights for women and we need to tackle misogyny and gender injustices and things like that. It's kind of people's choice. If they do want to do that, they can, but it does seem to me a little bit like, if I say that I am 5'8", even though I'm 5'4", 5, and I say that I'm decided to measure, feet and inches differently, and I'm now telling myself I'm 5'8". Okay, that's great. I feel that and I'm saying that. But if other people don't recognize that, no one else is going to see me as above my actual height. What's the point, right? So I think that if we're going to use these extremely personalized definitions of feminism, okay, like it's not the term, it's the ideas that matter more to me than the term. But I just think logically, it's not useful to necessarily use a term which hasn't got a widespread usage or a widespread definition that really is able to reconcile Islam and feminism. Other people, may also say that, but there'll be perhaps some things in the Islamic tradition they disagree with. They won't go to the extremes I've been talking about, but there'll be some people say, well, I think Islam is feminist because X, Y, Z. And other people will say, well, I think Islam is feminist because of X, Y, Z reason, which are different. So I just think we need to think about how useful it is to just use terms that are so ambiguous.
Great analogy, mashallah. So the next question is, for those who would like to utilize feminism as an analytical tool, any recommendations on an introductory material that Muslims ought to seriously engage with?
Oh, okay. This is a very good question. I can only speak to my expertise in this regard because, as I said, I come from this economics background and this background of international development. And I think that there is a lot to be said about how feminism does look at the workplace and does look at production and economics and how women have really been co-opted into these systems. And it's incredibly unfortunate because sometimes, we are sitting here having this conversation, largely, Muslims from the West, talking about how this manifests in the West. Feminism manifests, and not feminism, but women's issues manifest very differently in other parts of the world. And the kind of oppression that women are facing as a result of unjust, exploitative economic systems really needs to be addressed. And I think, yeah, shining a light on that is definitely very, very useful. But at the same time, I say that because that's my profession. Whereas other people I know, mashallah, are incredibly, we have such a wide range of expertise in our community. And if people do want to shine a gendered light on other topics, on other issues, I think there's definitely, there's probably space for that. Usually kind of, this kind of literature, dependent on the field that you're searching in, it is quite accessible if you just search in Google Scholar, feminist critique of whatever subject it is that you're studying. And I think, yeah, I don't want to speak to kind of other professions too much in terms of what critiques that gives, but it's useful because I think as well, very often we as Muslims, we like to think that we are critiquing these, we're living in this system, but we know that Islam provides an alternative. If these are the problems that we are observing today, we should be motivated to think, what alternative can Islam provide? And definitely where women are suffering under this, we should, use the critiques that are out there to say, okay, yeah, look, these are all of the problems that women are facing under this system in this country because of this economic policy, because of this political maneuver, because of this social reality. How could we use an ethically informed understanding based upon Islam to shine a light on those situations and to articulate some kind of solution? We have so much to offer the world, and I think sometimes we need to think more about what we can give rather than being on defensive all the time, if that makes sense.
So the next question is, one of the main contentions of feminists is that men should not be involved in discussions about women. How should the critique of feminism be done by men in a way that is acceptable to those on the other side?
Bismillah. Okay, this is a very good question. So from an Islamic basis, we know that we do not have this idea that, men cannot say things about women's issues, women cannot say things about men's issues, because as I said, we're supposed to be allies, we're supposed to be helping one another and guiding one another. And definitely when it comes to issues that are being considered by scholars in a very legal setting, we're not going to say, we're not going to listen to a male scholar until we've had a female scholar. That's absolutely, not something that we're going to start integrating into Islam now. But I think that what we can do is, first of all, as I think I mentioned in relation to the gender discourse, is seek out expertise. And very often, this expertise, the expertise of women, is something that can bring a wealth of knowledge to the table about understanding just even the circumstances surrounding a particular issue. And actually, you see this even in classical fiqh debates surrounding menstruation. And actually, when the scholars used to kind of debate in public about these things, there's an incident where a female scholar was debating with a male scholar, and the name has kind of escaped my mind at this point. But essentially, the female scholar won. And she concluded that I won because I experienced this in practice, while you know it in theory. So I think that when men do talk about women's issues, that's fine, but they can give consideration to the lived realities of women and ask women for their opinions and their thoughts prior to necessarily making a statement about it. And similarly with women, I mean, issues to do with, for example, femininity and masculinity are something that I have opinions about, but I'm very cautious of the way that I express my opinions in relation to masculinity, because I'm aware that I can't, know exactly what men feel and think about and what they believe is, masculine, and how it's important for them to acknowledge X, Y, Z. I can ask them about that, and I can say how it looks from my perspective, but acknowledge basically the limits of our expertise. And I think that inshallah could actually encourage more kind of communication that's productive, of people listening to one another and taking on board what we're saying, rather than just passing judgment about it. I feel like there was another part to your question that perhaps I haven't addressed. Was that it?
I think that was it.
Oh, that was it? Okay.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah.
The next question is, how can we address the issues you've raised today as a discussion topic with Muslim men, given they are the ones who set the tone for society, oppress women, and are ruled by cultural habit rather than Islamic principles?
I mean, I'd be actually welcome to hear if anybody else, or if any of the other brothers as well present would, be willing to share their thoughts on that, whether it's like kind of writing it in the chat box, or, writing it to you yourself. I think that very often the extent of abuse sometimes, the extent of the abuses that Muslim women are facing isn't properly understood. And I realized this recently when I saw some sisters talking about how very often, these stories are shared in female-only settings. That this woman got divorced because, her husband was being abusive towards her, or this person's, expectation of someone for marriage, for example, was based on these very unlikely, special, physical features. This person responded to this sister in this way, in an extremely inappropriate way. These are stories that are shared amongst women in female spaces, and men do not get the exposure to that. And so again, like I said, they think that there are these problems, but they don't see the multifaceted nature of them. So I think that by drawing men's attention to that, and by discussing that with the men in our families and our acquaintances, is a way to highlight that therefore when Muslim women are talking about XYZ, it's not just because they hate Islam or they want to emasculate their husbands and they want to neglect their children. There's actually a context happening to this conversation that you may not be exposed to, but that we are exposed to. And I think that can be a good way to open up the conversation. And then obviously as well, referring back to Islam, because this is a basis that we do all share. And whilst sometimes culturally informed opinions have become more dominant, really, if we're going by the authenticity of our sources, and we recognize that this is the whole point of usul al-fiqh, right? We've got this methodology for deriving an opinion. So if a certain scholar has derived an opinion, or amended something that is the practice of something, such as in Ibn Taymiyyah's time, the practice of having 2 women witnesses for financial issues was barely implemented. If we can point to that as an example of how scholars who are not quote unquote feminists and who are using the methodology of Islam to arrive at these conclusions, then I think people are a little bit more endeared towards doing that, towards listening. But I think as well, we should just always have the basis that these conversations are ultimately happening. We should have the basis that you want for your brother what you want for yourself. Perhaps in this case, it would be you want for your sister what you want for yourself. What we're talking about here is nothing excessive when we're talking about women's access to Muslim spaces or teachers and things like that. This very much just comes down to basic principles that we want to give and share other people of the benefits and of the advantages that we have. But as I said, I'd be open to, inshallah, hearing from anybody else as to how they also think that this conversation could be conducted with men particularly.
I'm not sure if we have any comments in the chat box, but just a quick reminder, we do have 14 minutes left and we do have a lot of questions, so we will try to get through as many as we can, inshallah. The next question is, you mentioned tajdeed as opposed to liberation. With respect to the topic of feminism, as well as other aspects of Islam that offend sensibilities, could you explain how to balance that line carefully and or how to distinguish?
Okay. So just to clarify as well, it was tajdeed versus liberalization. So again, not seeing these things as inherently stemming from a desire to water down or reform Islam, but as something that is extending Islam. I think though it's a good question that, we do obviously fall, that there is a risk that we are approaching this issue as well with our own perhaps biases, and we need to be careful of the kind of conclusions that we're making. And in relation to that, I think that's why it's important that first of all, we fall back on an appropriate methodology. The methodology that I would try to highlight some of these feminists are using clearly contradicts Islam, and is, first of all, it doesn't make sense in many ways, which is actually what I was trying to show foremost, but secondly, it contradicts Islam. So we need to, so that is why those conclusions are obviously going to be wrong. If we're using a methodology that is in line with what our tradition, has taught us, and then relying on things like, not necessarily kind of ijma', but like the expertise of, yes, scholars who are aware of those particular realities, whether those are scholars in the West or those are female scholars, I think that drawing on those is what we can use to make sure that we're balancing not reform of the deen, but definitely, furthering the deen and making Islam applicable to new realities. And I think that actually, that is a very sensible question, because Recently, I was in a conversation with a brother on a chat about the issue of muta, and this brother was presenting this as a muta being temporary marriage, and this brother was presenting this as a solution to, like, the prevalence of zina and non-marital relationships in our community. And this, for me, was an example of how this is a solution that doesn't derive from our methodology, because it's something that there is evidence to show that this practice was abrogated. And if we were to bring it back, this is just formalizing the kind of relationships that we see in the West. This is very much conforming to modern sensibilities with an added Islamic tint, with some restrictions perhaps, but it's not really actually tackling the issue. And I don't think it was being true to our tradition and to our scholarship to just say, well, this is the reality, we need to change and we need to do this, otherwise everyone's going to commit zina. So for me, that is an example of like where the boundary sits, that where things have been deliberately articulated, where those red lines are established by the Quran and Sunnah, we're not going to contradict those, but we're going to think about how, and this in many cases, it's just an attitude change we're talking about even. Yeah, it's about integrating rahma more into our conversations. It's about giving women, spaces and things like that, things that aren't articulated by such deliberate red lines like this. These are issues where there's already ikhtilaf. So acknowledging that, and yeah, again, staying within the boundaries of our usul, I would say, are the two kind of things to make sure we don't go too far into just submitting ourselves to our own desires.
Thank you. The next question is, to what degree do you think that feminism is a conscious ideological adoption among Muslims within the community, as opposed to the failure of the Muslim community to meaningfully communicate Islam's answers beyond sloganistic calls?
Oh, it's a very interesting question. I think it could definitely be both. I think it depends on which community as well, because obviously I've spoken here about things that I would say are definitely a general trends that we're observing in the Western world. But, much of this audience, and obviously Al-Arqam is in the US, and I don't know the ins and outs of the community even that Al-Arqam is based in, let alone the communities that are all over the US, or the communities that are all over the UK, to be able to ascertain to the degree that culture has influenced more than a failure to imbibe Islam. I think that often what we're seeing, though, is that people, where knowledge of Islam is becoming more, where people are gaining more awareness about Islam, we're seeing sometimes a drive to justify cultural practices with that knowledge. So it's almost kind of a combination of both. And this, again, I think is the result of being in an environment where we're seeing a lot of dialogue about these issues. These culture wars that are happening are forcing people to feel very nervous about, their own values and what those values are going to look like for their children in the next 5 to 10 years. And so they're keen to kind of protect themselves as much as possible and justify their positioning with Islam. Some of the ways they're protecting themselves are cultural, some of them are Islamic. I think we're seeing a conflation between the two. And again, I don't want it to be like this is a culture versus Islam thing. I think that there's definitely parts of culture that are negative towards women because they emerged in contexts and they were influenced by certain other cultures perhaps that did have things different to Islam. So in the subcontinent, particularly in India, there are attitudes towards women which are informed by Hindu culture and Hindu religion as well. Very much the fact that in India, the brides are the one who are still paying the dowry, even though mahar in Islam is supposed to be from the men's side. Right? So there's definitely things that are also things from foreign cultures in that sense. So I don't want to make it kind of a culture versus Islam thing, that culture is so bad. Cultures are very important. But I think as well, when we're in the West and just in the modern world today, in this very globalized world, we need to start thinking about the new culture that we're in and how can Islam accommodate for new cultures. The fact that, whether we like it or not, women are educated. The fact that we don't have, we're not living in Muslim countries. And so mosques are spaces where Muslims meet, where Muslims have to meet. Sometimes it's the only place Muslims will meet. So we have to have spaces for women, things like that, accommodating to new cultural realities. And yeah, recognizing that as a new culture that perhaps in other places, not saying that our Western solutions are necessarily applicable in other places either. There is a degree of localization that I think has to be considered.
There was actually a response to the question that you posed earlier
Oh, okay, yeah.
about men as allies. I've noticed finding men as allies to help support women's issues helps, i.e., women wanting space in masajid, etc., finding a man or men to speak on her behalf or with her. It's unfortunate that women's opinions on their own is not good enough, but having men as allies helps a lot. Allahu A'lam.
Yeah. I think I've also got a similar comment that's been sent as a direct message, but saying that, yeah, exactly, exposure is important. So presenting men who are willing to listen about these matters, would be useful. In my community, I try to help with cases of various family dynamics, and I've come to see that a lot of men are just not aware of many of the issues that are happening. At times, communication barriers between spouses, i.e., not understanding the other person, is another issue. I think that's definitely true. Yeah.
This next question is a little bit longer. You mentioned that men not providing for their family and women forcing them to work needs to be addressed by men. Another aspect is the power play of men who exert themselves physically onto women. How can women in this position break out of this situation without risking harm to herself by the husband and destroying the family unit? How can we tackle this when so many are stuck in these situations? How do we help those in this right now? Where does this responsibility lie, and who do we go to for help when my sisters on forums are saying, stick with your situation, you have to think of the kids, put up with the abuse, etc.?
Yeah. I mean, subhanAllah, I feel like this is definitely a question that unfortunately I'm not qualified to answer. I think, I'm first of all far too young to be giving anybody marriage advice. But on top of that, these realities are very widespread and they're very complex, and you need professional kind of intermediators in these situations. We need Muslim counselors for this reason. We need as well people of Islamic knowledge to come and intervene. Definitely, I think the one thing I can say to that is that we should definitely change this mentality that women need to stay in a certain situation for the sake of children, a situation that is very openly, violent and abusive towards that person. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always wants us to make effort, but when it comes at the expense of our mental or our physical health, then we need to realize that actually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to take care of ourselves first and foremost. And it's unfortunate that things like divorce are still a taboo in our community. I think there may be some signs of that changing. And it's interesting actually, because I was reading just earlier today a book about marriage and divorce in medieval Muslim societies in the Mamluk period. And it was talking about how divorce was incredibly prevalent compared definitely to Western society at the time. And I think it said something like in the 500 women that they were looking at in these historical records, a third of them had been married and divorced, sometimes multiple times. So this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put here as a mercy for people who you're not similar, things are not going right, to end that situation, not to feel trapped, and that we have that this is just a situation that we are condemned to because Islam says make effort. So I think definitely that narrative can change in our community, and sisters who are on the receiving end of that, I think definitely they need direct help to their reality, someone who can understand the circumstances and give them advice based on that. I do see several female scholars often dealing with these issues. I'm not sure about organizations in the US that deal with this, but I know that there are some organizations in the UK that do. I'm sure they do have them in the, actually, I don't know if Khalil Center in Chicago does marriage related issues. I know they do mental health kind of counseling and things like that. I'm not sure if they do that, but perhaps inshallah, if you guys can recommend any, or anybody else can put it in the chat, kinds of organizations that deal with things like this, inshallah it might be useful to the sister. Yeah, okay, someone said, yeah, Khalil Center does do marital and premarital and marriage counseling. So I mean, I think recommending somebody just more qualified than myself is what I can do here, but definitely recommending that people aren't hesitant to take that action, and seeking help when they need it, inshallah.
The next question is, what would you say to people who say feminism leads to kufr?
I think I'd say, what feminism are you talking about? Because until you define what you're saying, I can't really answer that question. Definitely, I think, as I showed, there is some kinds of feminism that lead to kufr. If you're starting to question if the Quran comes from Allah or is a reflection of what Allah wants, that's kufr. But in other kinds of feminism, you never know. Sorry to interrupt you, Behnan, but somebody has asked me a question directly on message, so I feel a little bit obliged to look at it. Muslim communal concerns over #all-male panels are of a relatively recent vintage and largely promoted by academics who want to earn brownie points. It seems to me that forceful diversification of panels can serve to disempower female voices by calling into question their individual achievements and competency. The aggressive pursuit of gender diversification today has little to do with restoring spiritually rigorous pedagogical settings and far more to do with reconciling Islam with liberal social norms. What are your thoughts? I think that I can't speak for, every single person who's tried to organize a panel and the kind of rhetoric that comes into a community when people are talking about these issues. So I'm sure that definitely there are some people who are, again, influenced by the cultural dialogue that we are having today in the world and are trying to make this an excuse for the fact that, yes, look, we should have women because, this is a modern norm and we're going to look backward as a community if we don't have that. And, this is the values of today we need to keep up. I'm sure that there are examples of that. I think, however, that there are also many people who do want, and, obviously then I say this as a Muslim woman, having spoken to many women, not just kind of in my social circle, but when I go around the UK to speak at events and things like that, I speak to people from different communities. And they do talk about how we wish we had female role models, even who they could ask questions to. Actually, a concern that I had today when I was doing this talk was that people could ask me quite specific fiqh questions. Because often when I've given similar talks on women-related issues, I get very specific like fiqh questions and misconception issues, because for many sisters, it's the first time that they've had a Muslim woman on a panel that they feel comfortable addressing this to. So I think that for those reasons, regardless of what other people may claim the reasons are, for those reasons, we should try and facilitate that. And if other people try and incorporate, their problematic reasoning into it, then okay, we can criticize the basis of their conversation, and we can definitely say, well, we shouldn't just have it because of this reason. But I think that there is definitely a legitimate reason to include women and to make sure that we are providing people as inspirations and to answer some of these questions that, otherwise people don't feel comfortable necessarily directing to male scholars. So just because, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, essentially, just because some people are making an invalid case for this doesn't negate the validity of our case.
I want to ask you if you had a couple more minutes to cover two shorter questions.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Sure. Sorry, I'm still seeing messages coming up, so that's why I keep being a bit kind of in between, but please go ahead.
Could you suggest a course/book or any resource to really dive deep into the Islamic discourse on gender?
I think those books are still waiting to be written. I think really what we're seeing is a lot of scattered resources at the moment that address different parts of this issue. I think, part of what I considered my talk was today was, inshallah, to really hopefully inspire people to do start thinking about this and to do start making their own contributions, whether that's in their own kind of professional field, as whatever it may be, counselors or teachers or academics or whatever it may be. But also, just as Muslims, us thinking about what does it mean to be a Muslim woman in the modern day? How can we ultimately worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all of the new realities that we're facing, right? This is the objective. So unfortunately, I don't think that there's just a single book that I could recommend, but I think there's definitely people who I would recommend following to see who do engage in that kind of discourse, who do talk about some of these issues. And these are largely female scholars. I mentioned, I think, Dr. Tamara Gray already. Dr. Haifa Yunus also, sometimes talks about some of these things. There's a scholar in Australia, Jamaluddin. She's, on Facebook. These people have as well their own institutes. They have their own courses. So very often, you can go and not only see their content, but you can sign up for a lesson with them. Dr. Aisha Waswas is somebody who is, as well, mashallah, very critical of the way in which, the liberal paradigm is affecting people's attitude towards Islamic laws pertaining to women. I mentioned as well Mariam Amir. I believe as well Sheikha Muslima Purmal, who I know is in California, does as well similar stuff, mashallah, with her husband and things like that. So I think following, and actually they've created recently, in a bid to try and get people involved in this discussion, they've created on Instagram a female scholars network that you can follow. I think it's just called Female Scholars Network. But these are Muslim women and educated Muslim women, traditionally qualified Muslim women, who are coming together from different places in the world to share their experience and their expertise about some of these issues. So I would recommend that people, inshallah, follow them and their contributions to see what can be offered. But as of yet, there's not like a single book that we can say, read this and you'll understand women in Islam and the position and the challenges today and the solutions. Khalas. Unfortunately, we don't have that.
The last question is about your organization. What does your organization do? Could you give a quick explanation of the Qarawiyyin Project?
Yeah, sure thing. So I think, as you said in the beginning, the Qarawiyyin Project was, alhamdulillah, started in 2018 as an initiative to really just try and engage Muslim women in these conversations, connect them as well to scholarship, to Islamic knowledge and ilm, for not just issues about women, but obviously as women, that does come up very often. Really, it's about trying to do, I think, perhaps some of the things that I've mentioned earlier today, like provide a space for Muslim women to, ask some of these questions and get in contact and see the examples of other qualified Muslim women and learn from them. It's also an opportunity for them to develop their own skills. So as a website, we accept contributions from sisters writing on a whole range of topics, and we really try and encourage people to think about what is your expertise and how can you use Islam or apply it to Islam, and offer some insights to the world about whatever it is that you're studying or you're working as on a daily basis. So alhamdulillah, we have like various articles on different topics on the website. Some of them are gender related, but there's also reflections on other kind of socio-political issues or current affairs. We also do quite a few book lists to really encourage people to kind of read from differing perspectives and inshallah, obviously, just increase our knowledge all of the time. We're also very invested in creating this kind of transnational community of sisters with an awareness of what is going on in the world as well, in the state of the ummah today, because we can't be just kind of considering our problems in a vacuum. It's just me and my local community. We need to have that global consciousness as well. And alhamdulillah, through the website and through the podcast is primarily what we put out, the content that we put out. But we have held events before, and inshallah, we're hoping to hold more as the summer comes around after Ramadan, inshallah. And we're always looking for people to get involved. So, feel free, inshallah, to check out the website and get in touch with us if you'd like to, contribute or get involved in any way, inshallah.
So inshallah, that concludes the questions that we're able to answer for today. Jazakallah khair, Sister Aisha, for sharing your wisdom and for your time with us. So if you'd like to access further readings and topics that address women's discourse, both related to feminism as well as inspire more relevant discourse on Islam, like Sister Aisha was saying, please make sure to check out the Qarawiyyin Project. It has been linked in the chat box. Additionally, make sure to tune into Al-Arqam Institute's upcoming sessions on scientism with Dr. Osman Omarji taking place next week, and the week following that, secularism with Sister Dania Muhammad. You can also check the chat box for the link to Al-Arqam's Facebook page as well as our YouTube page. And please make sure to follow and subscribe those for more updates. On our social media as well, you can find our newest session on Imam al-Nawawi's 40 hadith. So please make sure to check that out as well. And that's all from us, inshallah. Ramadan Mubarak to everyone, and may Allah accept your fasts, and assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.